let's be really honest here. This isn't a debate about whether or not countries will buy other countries' votes, because we recognise that that's happening under the status quo in a variety of ways that are substantially less transparent. When the US overthrows regimes in Latin America, one of the things it's thinking about is getting international support for its international agenda. When the US lends large amounts of money to Africa and knows that countries in Africa can't service that debt, it knows that what the result will be is that country will default and it will be able to claim diplomatic favours in return for writing off that debt. It's happening now. The question is how we as an international community deal with it. And we think considering it will always happen and always will happen, the best way to deal with it is to recognise it openly so that it happens in the most transparent way possible. With that in mind, what do we propose? We propose that this motion mostly occurs in the context of the bodies of the United Nations, and that's where we're going to debate it. Because the majority of the times that countries buy other countries' votes, or desire to buy other countries' votes, is when dealing with bodies of the United Nations. We think that's where this debate actually occurs. We recognise that this should be occurring on the basis of distinctive issues, rather than buying a country's vote for a period of 6 months. And we want it to happen in a way that is actually negotiated and actually explicit. We are giving you this amount of money for this vote. We think that is excellent for a variety of reasons we're going to talk about. And we do expect that countries will form blocks in order to sell votes in blocks to get greater benefit. And we do expect that countries will refuse to sell their votes on issues that they actually care about. Will sell them on issues that they care less about. I'm going to be talking about your right to buy and sell votes on these bodies. I'm going to be talking about transparency. I'm going to be talking about the harms of the status quo and how we best avoid them. I'm going to be talking about the nature of competition for these votes and all the benefits that accrue. So firstly, in terms of your right to buy and sell votes. Firstly, we'd say it's your vote and you have a right to do with it as you will. And we in fact think making decisions on a basis of money is probably actually better than a lot of the reasons that countries make decisions at the moment, where a lot of countries simply make decisions because they don't care and it's easier to just vote in one way or another or abstain from a vote. We think this is much better. We secondly accept that money is a way that people are allowed to leverage decisions, and it happens all the time. So it happens in terms of aid, where countries give aid in return for particular access to resources, and the international community accepts that all the time. It happens in diplomacy and trade relations, where countries give large amounts of money in return for favourable arrangements with other countries. We recognise that you have a right to benefit in this way from your vote, and we think that's pretty true in this debate. But we think that the biggest and most important thing in terms of actually monitoring that is by making it as transparent as possible. We can limit the harms. So let's talk about transparency in general, because it already happens. We think what happens at the moment is that countries use other diplomatic powers to leverage those votes. So Russia threatens to cut off gas supplies to the Ukraine and Belarus when those countries align themselves with the US or with the EU in the UN. We think that's a disaster for those countries. We see the deaths in Ukraine and Belarus as a result, when Russia cut off gas supplies in winter, killing civilians in order to buy that vote. We think money is far, far less bad for these countries. Yes.
Madam, your claim was that these votes are the countries dispose of as they will. We suggest the United Nations, because it legislates for everyone, has a mandate to act for everyone, not simply the self-interest of each nation.
Yep, and we're going to be talking about later how this actually is really good for the UN acting in the interests of the entire global community. What we'd say is that if that was the case, you wouldn't be giving votes to countries anyway, because they already make decisions that are based on their own personal benefit. This isn't about whether countries will do that. It's about the ways in which they do that and how transparent they are. We think the other real benefit of transparency is that there is a huge natural disincentive against the US explicitly buying votes, or against Russia or China doing so. Why? Because we think that when you do that all the time, you piss off other international actors really badly. It makes you look really colonialist. It makes you look really demanding of power and really grasping. So we think the only times that this will happen, once you make it explicit and transparent, is in the best possible ways. In the ways where a country desperately cares about an issue and thinks it is key to the survival of the international community that a vote occurs in a particular exact way, where the decision is actually not particularly controversial, and where they think they'll be safe in buying that decision without backlash. So let's talk about some of the harms of the status quo right now. So right now what happens, and I've alluded to these in my introduction, is that countries like the US or China lend massive amounts of money to, say, African nations, know that that country will never be able to service that debt, and know that when that country does it, they can demand votes from that country on anything they like in perpetuity. That is dreadful for civilians within these countries. That cuts cuts them off from development, it often cuts them off even from food and shelter. But what happens is even worse. We see the US, particularly in Latin America, actively assassinating leaders or supporting coups to strike out leaders who don't support their international agenda. So we point to the US assassinating Roldos in Ecuador, or assassinating Torresol in Panama, both of whom were killed by the CIA. That is so much worse for these countries because of the disruption that it causes to their economies, because of the disruption it causes to security within these countries. It is so much better if the US feels safe handing over a package amount to buy a vote to a desperate Latin American country than them shooting their leader or arranging a coup. We think it is substantially better that that occurs in a transparent fashion because it avoids all of the harms of exploitation that occur under the status quo. Let's move on to my final point in terms of competition. We think at the moment no one knows when it's happening, and that, by the way, includes the country whose vote is about to be bought. When you're a poor African nation, the US starts lending you amounts of money that you can never service. You don't expect that the result of that will be you having to sell over your vote to the US in perpetuity as long as you can't service your debt. This is substantially more transparent. That carries a burden of various benefits. Firstly, it gives small countries far more power to bargain because they expect it to actually happen. So they can demand more in return for their vote. It means countries know exactly how much other countries are getting for their vote and can therefore demand equivalent amounts. So it gives small countries far greater bargaining power. And it means moreover, that we think we have greater balance between the most powerful actors in the world. So countries like the US and China and Russia, or blocs like the EU, could probably afford to buy out every country in order to get a vote. But they can't afford to do it when other countries are also competing on those same issues. And that's what I alluded to earlier on in response to Doug's POI. That what this means is that those countries will be forced to compromise, because none of them can individually win out a vote. So when all of them care about an issue, they are far more likely to engage in compromise. And my second speaker is going to talk far more detail about how this actually occurs and the explicit ways in which that benefits everyone in the world in terms of international stability. Because it happens already. It destroys countries when it does, and this is a substantially better way to do it. We are proud to propose.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. We go to the opposition table, and I'd like to give the floor to Maria to open the case of the opening opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we've just heard from the proposition is 7 minutes about how self-interested big rich nations are and all the awful things they're willing to do in order to serve their own interests at the expense of everyone else. We think the problem with their model is that they don't change that underlying imperative on powerful nations. All they do is give these nations another tool, and a particularly pernicious tool, to not only oppress poor countries, but also to collapse and completely prevent international organisations from achieving the goals that they set out to achieve. So I'm going to make a few points of rebuttal before moving to the 3 arguments of the opposition. Number 1, why we think this harms poor countries. Number 2, why we think this perverts international bodies. And number 3, why we think this doesn't benefit the kind of good things that rich or powerful countries may wish to do. But first of all, some rebuttal. Now, the first thing they told us is that this happens anyway, let's just make it transparent. So we have a number of problems with this. Firstly, many nations just don't want to do this. They will not accept bribes for their votes. That's going to change under their model because nations will be forced, as they said, to accept bribes for their votes because that becomes the norm. So for example, Mexico and Chile, under our model, were able to say to the US, no, we're not going to support you going into Iraq. We think it's very important that nations can do that. Under our model they do, under their model they can't. Secondly, we think nations are far more reluctant to bribe other countries under our model because of the fact that it is not an established norm, it's not an accepted thing, and if you are outed, it is incredibly damaging, thank you, for your nation and future diplomacy. On the issue of transparency, firstly, who's enforcing this transparent action? If they accept that rich countries control these organisations and want to serve their own interests, we don't see how you're going to have some like world police who are going to come in and make sure everything's transparent, given the intrinsic problem of big countries, big powerful countries, always controlling these organisations. Secondly, we think even if you can enforce some kind of transparency, there is always an incentive to go under the table in addition to any kind of open negotiation negotiations because it's going under the table, it's getting one up on the other people who are also trying to bribe, it's doing things in secret that actually gives you some extra weaponry in terms of playing the diplomatic war and getting what you want. Nations do that under the status quo, they'll continue to do that, no thank you, under their model. Furthermore, they have this idea that, well, look at all these bad things nations do. Look at Russia cutting off gas supplies. Ladies and gentlemen, what we say is Russia's going to continue cutting off gas supplies as long as it gives them more diplomatic power over smaller nations. They say countries want this kind of power. They say countries have these interests. We say they don't change that. Now Russia can cut off gas supplies and also prevent smaller countries from having the only forum in which they can have any power and any kind of equal vote and takes that away from them. So all the bad things they talk about continue to happen. The US is still going to fund coups if it thinks it's a good idea to fund coups. Now it's just the case that smaller countries who try to oppose that don't have an international body they can effectively work through to do that because of the fact they are being bought out. Okay, so on to the first issue. Does this benefit poor countries? The first thing I'd like to make absolutely clear is we don't think that their magical utopia where the only time you sell votes is when it's really, really important to the rich nation and not at all important to the poor nation is going to be the situation where that occurs. We say, ladies and gentlemen, if you're a nation that doesn't have a lot of money and someone's offering you a lot of money, you are always going to accept that, and that is going to be at the expense of your own interests. I'll take the closing.
Okay, if Togo gets a boatload of money from the United States and then votes with the United States interests, don't you think people are going to figure it out?
Yes, they probably will. And here's the problem with that. Number one, the money doesn't trickle down. Oh, okay, I am going to give that now. So you're saying the populace is going to be like, that's really bad, you shouldn't do that, government. The problem is their model says it's really good. This should be the norm. This should be what always happens. So we say, first of all, it actually means it's very difficult to argue against vote buying because now it's the accepted thing that everyone has to do. Secondly, we think even if people do oppose it, all that actually does is create a large amount of animosity between poor nations in terms of the populace and then their governments interacting with bigger nations. And we think there's actually a very big problem in terms of those nations having effective diplomacy. So number one, the money doesn't trickle down because once you establish a norm of vote buying, it's easiest to bribe the delegates involved, not the nation as a whole. It's much cheaper, it's much simpler, it's much more convenient. That's what's going to happen. When you bribe those individual delegates, that money doesn't go anywhere near the poor people of Togo. See, for example, the British arms deal between BA and Saudi Arabia. So what happened there was that the prince was bribed. So what happens is that often there's not much of a difference between the ambassadors and the representatives of these nations and also the elite class within these nations. So the money just goes to that elite class. On the populace, no thank you, doesn't benefit. If that elite class is particularly bad and oppressive, all you do is fund that class to be worse. Secondly, we think you get a race to the bottom. They see what you think you get is compromise because everyone needs to be buying votes. No, what it means is you try and bribe as much as possible. All you need is a majority, right? So if countries say no, say, actually, I want to serve the people's interests, I'm not going to accept your bribe, they lose out because number one, the issue still passes because everyone else got bribed and they didn't. But they don't end up with a bribe, they end up with nothing. So obviously, it's in their benefit to always accept the bribe. So you get a race to the bottom in terms of who can employ the dirtiest tactics, who can push the most money forward, and you lose the ability of these nations to serve their interests. Thirdly, you have regional animosity. We see that already there's a lot of animosity when small countries are seen as proxies for big powers. So see, for example, the relationship between Venezuela and Colombia, when Colombia is seen as a proxy of the US. Now you have a receipt to prove it, ladies and gentlemen. What that means is it harms massively the ability of those nations in that region to work together because they're seen as pawns of these bigger players. It just only heightens the polarization between them. Finally, we say poor countries have collective interests which get smashed under their model. For example, laws of the sea. You've got poor, small, landlocked countries that want access to ports, but if you split those countries away by bribing them and preventing them voting in their own interests as a collective, you absolutely prevent them being able to serve that collective interest because you're instead serving the interests of the big power. Secondly, we think this perverts international bodies. They tell us it's just your vote, you can do what you want, nations don't care. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that the International Whaling Commission is also deciding about things that affect generations to come. The UN Security Council is not just about the 15 members on that council, it's about the whole world and our right to live in a secure society. What they do is they stop people voting on the issues. They stop people voting on the interests because they're voting on their financial interests, not the interests of A, the whole collective, which I think nations generally should and do care about, and B, even their own interests, where it's about something like security. You crowd out dialogue, so not even debate can exist because people are just going to debate on behalf of the people who are buying them out, not on behalf of their own interests. Finally, we think that it harms the legitimacy of these organisations because the public don't see the UN as legitimate anyway. But it gets so much worse when the UN is just seen as a buyout club where everyone with the biggest wallets wins out. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, when countries like the US do bad things, we think they don't get the moral legitimacy of saying, well, the UN said we could do it under our model. They do under theirs because the US can just buy out everyone else to make it look like that action was legitimate when it wasn't. Ladies and gentlemen, this is bad for poor countries, it is bad for international organisations. We are most proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We go back to proposition. I'd like to propose again to close the case of the opening document.
I'd like to recommend that the opposition in this debate have a look at the New York bestseller list, because recently a book was published by John Perkins called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Tell you what that book said. It said that he was explicitly hired by the United States government, but never on any payroll, to negotiate contracts with countries that were of particular diplomatic interest to the United States that they could never pay back in order to ensure the exact same outcome as our model ensures, which is that those countries will vote for the things that the United States wants. So in the worst case scenario, where nobody can ever say no to a vote, and I'm going to tell you why that's completely ludicrous in a second, in the worst case scenario, we get the status quo without all of the massive harms of economic dependence of those countries, of ruining those countries' political systems when the United States government kills their leaders. And that's the reality that the opposition wanted to avoid in this debate. So let's deal with some points of rebuttal. First, can nations ever say no to a bribe? We say a couple of things. First, if they acknowledge that countries right now are able to stand up to the United States, considering how powerful they are, we think they'll also be able to stand up to them under our system if they particularly care about the vote. But the funny thing about our system is that usually you'll have opposing sides both trying to buy out votes, right? So if you're a country that doesn't really want to agree with the United States, that actually thinks the war in Iraq is a terrible idea and don't want to vote for it, then you'll go to the people who agree with you, who will also be willing to offer you money for your vote, right? So the likelihood is that realistically, and this was what Madeline brought you, the got no analysis, in that instance where there is such a divide and countries can both afford to buy out votes, nobody will be able to win the vote outright. And that means they will have to negotiate with one another, and they will have to consult with one another. So we think that's good anyway. But secondly, she said, it becomes the norm, so then countries feel silly being able to say no, right? We're okay if this becomes the norm, because it undercuts all of her other analysis. The countries will absolutely always still go underground, right? If this becomes the norm, countries explicitly paying off other countries, we think the scrutiny benefits are incredibly important. So let's move on to transparency for a second. She said, nobody thinks that the big institutions like the UN are legit because people can see now that they're going to be buying off each other's votes. We'll say a couple of things. The reason why right now people question the legitimacy of the United Nations is because big countries already dominate the discussion, so that's the first problem that they don't fix. But secondly, because most people, unlike the opposition, recognise that the United States and Russia already leverage all of these diplomatic forms of forcing people's votes, even when the person doesn't get any choice to opt in or out of that system. That's why people think it's not legitimate. We think transparency is really important for fixing that problem. So she said, there's no way you can get it to be transparent. We say the United Nations, whilst it's dominated by big interests, still has administrators who can actually look over if a contract was signed by a particular country when they come in to hand in their vote. We think that's actually more likely to happen to the United Nations than, I don't know, when you're just doing a backdoor deal. And then she said, there's still an incentive for countries to go under the table. There's still an incentive for Russia to cut off oil and gas to create a problem. We say that the reason why Russia can get away with doing those types of things now is because they claim they have no other capacity to influence people's decision making. We think that applies because this method doesn't apply. We think once you say this is the explicit way that you can actually convince countries to vote on your behalf, we agree, it does become the norm. And as soon as it becomes the norm, it makes it much, much harder for countries to justify doing those kinds of actions. We acknowledge that those will still happen. We say those will be minimised, and that's a distinct benefit on our side. But secondly, we say the risk of being found out when you do those things is quite high. The reason countries are willing to take that risk now is because they don't think that they have another option, because they can't go explicitly and say, we will pay you X amount of money for a particular vote. We think that once they can avoid that risk by doing an explicit thing, they absolutely will. But then let's deal with this third issue of whether or not people are actually better off under our system. They said, first, it doesn't trickle down because you're only bribing diplomats or people that attend. You say, first off, people that go to the UN are the representatives of those countries' governments, right? So, in the case where you're able to bribe that diplomat, you most probably would have been able to bribe that country as well, right? If you're saying that it's just some dictator sending his crony to get money, that happens under the status quo. But we say, in the case where it's like legitimate countries that attend the UN in good faith, then that money will absolutely be negotiated explicitly, which means countries and people in those countries have a claim to that money now, and that's different than the status quo. You can just bribe diplomats and no one ever knows about it. We think that's better off for the people of those countries. Secondly, we told you these countries can collectivise to organise votes and to organise groups of votes, which means they're more likely to get more money for those votes, and they can compare the amount of money that other people are being offered, which they don't have any capacity to do under the status quo. That was a benefit that got no response. Instead, all she said is this leads to animosity between countries, because they're seen as proxies for big powers, like example there, Venezuela and Peru. We say those problems exist now because people actually believe now that big countries dominate the discussion. We think when you make it explicit and Venezuela is also selling their vote to another country, it looks pretty high and mighty for Venezuela to come and call out Peru for being a proxy of the United States. We think, if anything, it it actually makes the playing field level, and we think that's incredibly important for our side. Yes, ma'am.
You told us countries won't want to be seen to explicitly pay people. That means they'll still go through diplomatic channels, but people will be able to say that they fixed the problem.
No, I said they would want to be seen to explicitly pay people once it becomes the norm, which you've said it would be, and we said ultimately the risk of doing that is going to be far, far less than doing something which could garner you a whole lot of scrutiny, like, for example, just cutting off oil and gas and killing a whole lot of people. So, let's talk about consultation and how our model better engenders the type of discussion that the opposition wanted in this debate. Because we'll tell you that in the instance where you've got two big powers competing on a particular issue and both trying to buy out votes, if they do reach a deadlock, then they have to still negotiate. But in the instance where we think that they're actually trying to win people's votes, also on the actual proposal, because they're both offering the same amount of money to those individuals, then they have to convince countries that they should vote in favour of a particular proposal. We think that's a benefit that doesn't occur under the status quo, because those countries never even know that they're going to be forced to vote on that basis, because the US might just call in a vote under the table on the basis of some loan that they've leveraged a whole lot earlier. But secondly, we think the other benefit is you can demand that policies be changed slightly or be changed to reflect what you want, and that's why you'll give them money, and that's why you'll hand over your vote. So we think once that process becomes established and normalised, then countries are also going to be able to demand that particular policies are modified in particular ways, and they'll use that as a leverage for handing over their vote. We think that's incredibly important. Because right now, big countries don't consult small countries about these types of discussions. They just say 3 minutes before the vote, hey, remember how we run your canal? We're going to shut it down unless you vote in favour of this particular policy. We think that's incredibly problematic. We think we make this explicit, which means dialogue between those big countries and those small countries is much, much better off. The status quo happens just as the opposition said that our model would. We provide you the benefits of explicit transparency and allow people to scrutinise those things, but we also allow countries to go to the other way if they don't want to vote in favour of the motion. That never happens under the status quo. We were very happy to propose this model.
Thank you very much for that speech. We go back to the opposition. I'd like to go to Doug to close the case for the opening up.
Madam Chairman, 18 hours ago, World's Council proved that you don't need to buy votes in order to get some pretty excellent negotiations. What we're going to tell you today inside opposition is a couple of things. First of all, I want to hit this shibboleth we've got from First Proposition about how somehow this is just about, making a legal contract, bringing this stuff out of the black market. So how things don't get better and how you actually get more bribery. Secondly, I want to talk about how you crowd out very good discussions. First, lots of rebuttal. They said, we said that this would be rich countries buying poor nations, and predominantly, which would not be in their interest. They said, no, it's okay. So there'll be a rich country on either side of the issue, and you both compete for bribes. Two problems with that. One, there are a number of international issues which explicitly come down to rich versus poor blocs. Oftentimes rich countries have the same sorts of interests because they're rich. See Doha, see climate change, etc. The reason that Doha negotiations were able to be sunk over the TRIPS and the Singapore issues, sorry for Geek Fest, I'll stay away from that, is particularly because the poor nations were able to caucus together and say, stop that right now. What they do on their side of the house is they lose that ability to block as easily. Why? Maria just told you the reason. Because once you have bribes going, it's just easier to siphon off a couple of votes from an otherwise strong bloc, whose general national interest is to stop bad policies. Secondly, they said, well, it's really good because now Venezuela can be a Chinese proxy and Colombia can be an American proxy, and then they'll get along famously. What? Like, it doesn't improve a proxy war to have more proxies that are no longer legitimate representations of their nation. Actually, look to the way Latin America negotiated its Security Council seat recently. They chose Guatemala, particularly because Guatemala put its hand up and said, we're not anybody's proxy. They weren't a Chavezista, and they weren't completely in America's pocket either. Then they said, well, it's really great, because Russia is able to justify this bribery by saying, like, we just have no power whatsoever. Like, what can we do? First of all, Russia doesn't justify this at all. They don't even admit to doing it. And, like, secondly, they said, like, Russia's not the sort of state they're empowering. They just gave us lots of reasons in their own case why Russia's a very powerful, nasty state they shouldn't be empowering. Finally, they said, this is good for states because the delegates are representing their country. I think Maria kind of put away with that naive analysis when oftentimes delegates aren't representing their country's best interests. Here's also the difference, right? Now if, like, the dictator of Togo gets a bribe and he goes into caucus with his mates, like, he now at least has to make a justification under our side as to why it's a good policy. He can't simply stand up and say, I was bribed. There are norms against that, both in the international community and, I dare say, amongst domestic governments. This is bringing me into my first point, right? These guys say, like, look, there's just this set amount of bribery in the world that everyone accepts, and we're just putting contractual regulations on it so you can sue in frustration or whatever. What we say on our side of the house is, like, nations don't like being bribed. They don't like accepting bribes. They know, even as Maria tells you, if they make an offer, they could get caught out. So see what Newsnight did when it blew the cover on FIFA negotiations, causing a huge amount of embarrassment to everyone who participated in those bribery deals. See what happened when there was domestic opposition to the fact that the AE systems, as Maria tells you, tried to pass off bribes to the Saudi government. We don't think this is a Western affectation. Words like mercenary, words like whore, carry pejorative connotations in every culture when you substitute monetary incentives for things that ought to be determined on different grounds. As a result, what we say on this side of the house is, you not only divide people from their governments and cause huge amounts of animosity towards the Western governments that have bribed them, but you oftentimes get delegates no longer voting in their nation's interest. No thank you.
Sir.
Then they said their basic case was that, like, powerful nations do lots of bad stuff anyway. They assassinate people and invade them. First of all, they said it would just be better if they just got their way anyway, just buy it ahead of time so they didn't have to kill people later on. Well, like, if they're wielding a huge big stick, and now you're giving them a huge big carrot, they're much more likely to dominate because they've got more tools in their arsenal. But moreover, as Maria tells you, they've got good reasons for trying to mine harbors in Nicaragua anyway that have nothing to do with buying votes on the UN. Most of the examples they give you, in terms of cutting off gas to Ukraine and stuff, had nothing to do with UN votes. They had to do with other mechanisms. So as a result, this domination is still going to continue, but you've just formalized it. You've removed one of the biggest bright lines the United States has to say, look at Russia, they're a crappy nation, how do we know this? Because they bribe people. They don't actually argue for the interests of their people. They don't actually argue for what's in global interest.
Sir.
Nor do we think this sort of stuff is fixed, that it won't increase. They said, well, small nations lose out anyway. And they talked about Iraq. They talked about, the US rampaging across Latin America. Like, there are limits on these sorts of things. When the ICC condemned the United States in the US versus Nicaragua, Oliver North got sacked when the Contra scandal blew, so there are limits on how far the US influence can go. What Maria tells you is the one check that small nations have in a pitifully weak international order is to be able to stand up and say, we don't grant legitimacy to the United States invading Iraq. We can stand up in the WTO and other organizations and caucus together. All they're doing is removing the one moral check that small nations would otherwise have against the powerful. I'll take it from closing.
Okay, so let's say the incidentally democratic nation of Togo was going to vote for the proposal anyway, but now they can play coy and get a boatload of money in addition for their people. Wouldn't that be a net benefit for the people of Togo?
Well, it assumes, I don't know very much about the institutional structures of Togo. It presumes, for one, that money would trickle down. I think Maria's seen a lot of analysis. Even in a nominally democratic state, we think that's fairly unlikely. Secondly, say if it's such a good policy, and Togo is really benefiting from the policies that come up, why not just vote for it because it's a good policy and the people of Togo have benefited? Secondly, what we say is that this means that, it's not to my second point, we say furthermore that oftentimes when the issue gets lost, you get bad sorts of policies more generally. We think that when the issue gets lost under their model, like you no longer talk about the merits of a particular issue at hand. As a result, we think that blocks get broken. You see nations being siphoned off by other nations, and that removes their collective bargaining advantage, which they already have when the only issue on the table is the issue that they have of the issue at hand, not simply that they've got bribery. These guys, in the second speaker, said quite explicitly, we want a huge contractual negotiations process where you can all compare notes and say, gee, you're getting quite a good bribe. We should argue for a much better deal. Here's the difficulty. If World's Council has told me one thing, if negotiating for the bid of World's told me one thing, one of their biggest advantages is not knowing how many votes the other side has. One of the biggest advantages is to hide from the other side exactly how strong your position is. So you still have an incentive to go under the table. They said, well, it's the same amount of bribery either way. It's a balance. Here's the difficulty. You've now cheapened forever the norm that bribery is not what happens when we caucus together as nations. So when you go under the table, when Newsletter Panorama finally blows the cover on you, when the domestic opposition movements in these democratic states finally say, what have you been doing? You can shrug your shoulders. You can wink. You can say, that's the cost of doing business. At least now, with an international system, however pathetically weak it might sometimes be at the point of application, at least has the ability to establish clear norms as to what ought to be decided. These organizations don't just legislate for individual members, they legislate for generations on board and nations which will never benefit under their model. And it's in their name that we beg to oppose. Thank
Thank you very much for that speech. We go to the second half of the debate, and I'd like to give the floor to Sarah to open the case for closing government.
What Sam and I are going to talk about is what really affects the everyday lives of people in the kinds of nations we're talking about. That is to say, money. We're going to talk about how poor nations are going to have more money, and that's going to benefit people. But first, I'm going to get, I know that's a complicated argument, I'll make it really clear to you. First I want to get into some refutation. So, the first thing they said is, there's not going to be increased transparency. And then Sam asked a point of information, well, if a small country gets a massive check from a big country and then votes with that big country, isn't everyone going to know? And she said, well, yeah. And we said, okay, transparency issue settled. So second of all, then they said there's going to be this race to the bottom because there's going to be all this competition for who can throw the most money at poor countries. And we say, we call that a race to the top. We think the competition is really great and small countries can get more money out of big countries. Then they said the small countries are going to have their interests hijacked. And this is the crux of their case. So, okay, first they said there's going to be this problem because small countries aren't going to anymore have the ability to have a moral check. And we say, if in the status quo, they point to Chile standing up to the United States, under great pressure from the United States. And the United States could offer Chile a whole lot of things diplomatically and fiscally in the status quo. Then we say, there's still going to be a moral check on the face of great pressure in the future, if that is what's in the country's best interests, and that's fine. Then they said there's going to be this thing about collective interests. Small country blocks are no longer going to be able to organize in the same way. And we say, well, first of all, rich nations don't often oppose these sorts of small interests that have to do with, like, fishing right around the small countries' areas. Second of all, we say, so oftentimes these small countries have similarly, sometimes they have, egregious interests, like the same way that large countries sometimes have egregious interests. We say it's pretty much 50-50. So if, the oil states of the Middle East want to keep oil artificially high everywhere in the world, we think it's fine that that kind of block would be broken up. They would have had to tell us why small countries' interests are inherently better or more valid than large countries' interests. Second of all, we say, if their interest, in an individual small country interest, is in getting more money, they say, oh, it's going to be so awful because some countries are going to be siphoned off. And we say, if those individual countries feel that they're going to break the particular block and get more money for themselves, then fine. That's probably what's in their larger interest. They've decided it for themselves, and we think they have the legitimacy to do so. Then they have this argument about perverting international organizations. And we say, we'd rather have this. First of all, we think that there's probably going to be less legitimacy, because there's going to be more transparency. But second of all, we say, if it means a better life for people in small nations, we're okay with this perception of illegitimacy. We don't think it has a large impact. Finally, on this idea of carrots instead of sticks, which was the case of the Vietnam proposition. We say, instead of tariffs on Vietnamese products, or installing dictators in Chile, they're going to pay people. We say it does trade off, and here's why. We're going to provide that link. The first is because it guarantees the vote. So you have this mechanism that's easier to use and more straightforward, and you're probably going to use it instead. But why won't you also do the punishments? Because then you don't have to sacrifice goodwill in these small countries. Goodwill is incredibly important for enacting what your policy is going to be. We say that if you can also maintain your emotional sphere of influence, your influence over the hearts and minds of a particular people, then you're also going to be able, and then we say that you're much more likely to pay them and not to do stuff that sacrifices that goodwill. Go.
Madam, you're predicating on your case of this corrupt mechanism crowding out other corrupt mechanisms. Do you honestly, can you name a nation that the United States has invaded or assassinated which wasn't a UN vote?
No, I'm not going to name a nation for you. But what I'm going to do is tell you that legitimate nations that you talk about, that you discuss, said would know, they said, oh, well, right now what happens is there's no legitimate nations that do this. And we say, exactly. Those legitimate nations are the ones that lose out. And I'm going to get into my main point now, which sort of focuses on that idea. So first of all, we say, it is important, incredibly important, that poor countries get money. We say, obviously we've all conceded that in this debate that the small countries are going to be the ones who are going to be bought because they want money and large countries have money. We say that this is also likely to happen because there's going to be competition, which we think is incredibly important. So if one large country is like, oh, I want to maintain my sphere of influence, I'm going to go pit against another one, like the US and China, for example. We think what ultimately is going to happen is that poor countries are going to be able to say, I'll vote for you and play, or if you give me X, but other country X offer me X, and do it out in the open, and do it transparently, and do it legitimately, and then they're going to be able to play each other off one another in order to create lots and lots of money. What can they do with this money? Well, first of all, we think mainly what we're talking about is the countries that are legitimate, that are democratic, that are good. Why? Because in the status quo, the bad countries can already do this kind of stuff. But right now, what we're offering you is a legitimate mechanism for the countries that are genuinely good countries, that already obey the rules. Countries like Chile, that they love so well. Countries like Togo, which we enjoy and love. All these sorts of countries are going to be able to say, now, I was missing out before because I didn't accept bribes and I didn't want to lie to the international community. But now I can get all this money and invest it in my people. So what can they do? They can use this money to invest in infrastructure and grow the economy and pay off debt. And we say that, for example, the case of Taiwan, the United States gave them a massive amount of money because they were opposed to China. Taiwan was able to create a massive computer industry, which means more money for everybody. We think that that is obviously good for the people, but furthermore, it allows them to be less of a puppet of the West in the long run, right? Or the East or whatever. Because in the long run, what they can do is grow their economy and invest in their economy, and then maybe someday they too can buy votes. It's every little country's dream, right? So anyway, we think that that's really important. But even if they're like, oh no, now it just provides a legitimate or more likely mechanism for all of these bad countries, we say, fine, that's okay too. Because in the vast majority of cases of these bad countries, although they're already getting the money anyway, we think even if they get slightly more money, we're okay with that. Because there's less money for the elites, as they talk about, to siphon off from the citizens. Right? So if the elites are able to, there's X amount of money the elites want, and then they take it, they're going to take it in a particular country, whether or not they're getting this bribe. But we say, so for example, the only reason that massive numbers of North Koreans aren't starving to death right now is because there's a black market for US food aid. What we think that this shows is that aid is incredibly important, even in regions where there's an evil dictatorship, because some of it inevitably trickles down. Even if it's 5%, that's 5% more money in a region for where citizens are dying, where they're oppressed, where they're unhappy, and we think that's incredibly important. So why do we think that money is the most important issue in today's debate? Because they seem to be concerned about all these larger issues, legitimacy of international norms, all of these sorts of things, and we're concerned about the particular people in the small countries that they want to protect. We're concerned about how they get food on the table, how they can grow their infrastructure, how they can walk to work, how they can do all these sorts of things that we know that they need. We are absolutely proud to
Thank you very much for the speech. We go back to the opposition table. I'd like to vote to open the closing opposition.
Chairperson, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, our extension today is going to be twofold. We're going to talk about how this forces a choice between short-term national development and international interest and involvement which ultimately benefit the country in the long run. Then we're going to talk about how this harms the good policies that they want to get through and how we feel that that's a particularly pernicious harm. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, some refutation. The harm they told us in the status quo was that countries are false, that that's an unfortunate reality and that it harms civilians on the ground. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that the side effect of their policy is that it occurs more, that this happens in every single country, which is more harmful. We think that's in direct tantamount to what their proposition was set up to do. Moreover, right, they told us they won't want to be seen to buy votes, so it will only be on issues that are particularly important. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we ask whether Russia ever cares what the hearts and minds of the citizens in certain countries they like to regularly force to die, ladies and gentlemen. Think about them. But moreover, we think majoritarily what will happen, if their policy is correct and they don't want to be seen, is that, no thanks, is that, ladies and gentlemen, that they'll still use the diplomatic pressures, i.e. cutting off gas runs, for the most situations, and will only buy votes in particular scenarios. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a reality. We think that's particularly harmful because it hurts smaller nations the most. Moreover, right, we think that the perception means that A, they'll probably engage diplomatic relations to begin with the most. Why is that? It's because cutting off gas, ladies and gentlemen, is cheaper than me having to buy votes by any other way. That's a reality. We don't think Russia care, ladies and gentlemen, about their perception in the international society, particularly since First Stop told you that they've never been able to prove, really, that Russia do it anyway. Moreover, secondly, they told us that the countries now have a choice to go the other way. No. What will happen is they'll say, oh, here's some money. The country has a backbone and says no. Then they cut off their gas, ladies and gentlemen. We think this is now a double pressure, so they have to go with the way big countries want. Moreover, it legitimizes said pressure because it says it's okay for big countries to demand this of small countries. We think that's harmful. In terms of competing interests, 3 points on this. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, the USA versus Iraq, who's going to win, right? In reality, we're talking about countries with vast sums of money versus countries who do not have the same money. Moreover, one country is always going to have more resources in reality, and we think that's harmful. Secondly, in terms of what the second prop just told us, right? The country that we're talking about most here isn't the United States, who's in mass deficit. It's China, ladies and gentlemen, who can afford to buy the most votes possible, right? How is it that the Chinese citizens have benefited Darfur by their involvement at the moment? The reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that money that you give to countries like Darfur actively harms civilians on the ground in that way. We think that's incredibly harmful. We're going to talk about that more later. In terms, ladies and gentlemen, right, of what's best for the small country, okay, we say this is our substantive, that forcing a choice between short-term national interests is incredibly harmful. First prop told us that we'd be allowed to stand up to them now. No. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that in situation of the good countries you're talking about, the second prop set of this up, your citizens getting healthcare versus people in Iraq dying means you'll always choose your citizens in the short term, right? Because maybe you do need money. Why is that harmful? It says because it's short-term choices versus future interests. Why is that bad? It's because they're countries that we're talking about do need money in the short term, right? But the point of the UN is that bad things don't happen to bad people in the long run. Why is that? In terms of, let's say, the environment, right? In the short term, it is a good thing that I have money versus don't have large abilities to trade carbon emissions. Why is that harms countries? Let's look at India, right? The ability of India to develop at a rapid pace, creating a lot of carbon emissions, is something that is intrinsic to national development, ladies and gentlemen. However, policies like this means that future choices, future long-term development will be harmed by short-term choices like having a boat full of money for Togo right now. We think that's incredibly harmful. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we think it encourages and incentivizes self-interests. That's always been the problem that we've seen with the United Nations, that the right to sell your future choice, right, is what goes. We think that that harms international cooperation, as it incentivizes more self-interest to begin with. We think self-interest is what is called all of the problems that proposition have told us. We think legitimizing in this way, saying the only thing that matters is what your country is benefiting in, harms future policies. Moreover, we think it creates a perception, and I'll take first half in a minute, that national interests are all that matters, ladies and gentlemen. We think, in terms of, let's say, Kyoto and things like that, States may not recognise right now why that will benefit them. In the long run, it has way more detrimental effects than not getting a boatload of money right now. See at the moment what's happening with the Whaling Commission, right? Rich countries bought boats. Rich countries are now able to benefit from fishing as much as they want. Small countries can't develop a fishing industry. Go first, half.
Yeah, the reason why we can't get environmental consensus is because there's a monetary gain by polluting the environment. That's why countries vote against it now.
Yeah.
We at least give them money to develop the infrastructure to eventually get over that.
Environmental concerns are bad for poor countries at the moment. They benefit the West. That's why we can't get consensus. For countries like India, for countries like China, ladies and gentlemen, they need to be able to develop at the same rate that we allowed Western countries to. The point of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, is for global benefits, not Western liberal democratic countries, aka the United States of America interests, ladies and gentlemen. That's the policy that they just told us about. In terms of harming good policies, a couple of things. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that things that would normally pass easily, right? Beneficial proposals, right? That the first proposition told us about. Now, small countries won't just automatically vote for them, they'll demand money for it. That's what second prop conceded. We think this means that the world is worse off because the benefit and the proposals that we get from being engaged in the United Nations are automatically harmed, ladies and gentlemen, because only the countries that country can afford to pay will be passed. We think that's harmful. In terms of things that do pass, it means we don't have the legitimacy granted from global votes. The perception is that it's always illegitimate, which harms global cooperation, particularly in terms of things like war in Iraq or China's actions in Darfur, ladies and gentlemen. It destroys the point of the UN existing to begin with, the point that every nation, regardless of money, has a vote. We think that's harmful. In terms of global organisations, policies and discourse, we think it's incredibly important, ladies and gentlemen, for individual countries to realise that they don't have an interest in what's going on. Every decision, every discussion made at the UN Forum will affect your country, whether it's now, whether it's in 10 years, whether it's in 20 years. We think when you incentivise saying, ladies and gentlemen, that the decisions made in international organisations are irrelevant to you, that no such thing as a global consensus exists, we think that inherently harms the idea of a global consciousness and actions that we take at a global stage. It destroys, ladies and gentlemen, the point of having a vote at all. It destroys civilians, it destroys poor countries, it destroys the world. We beg you to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We go to the summary speech for today. I'd like to for the Sen to close his side of the House.
Side opposition offers you a world where America and China control everything, the UN is seen as an illegitimate body, and nothing gets done. Great! That would be the worst world to live in, wouldn't it? Although it is the world that we already live in.
Yeah.
On side proposition, we give you a world where poor countries are marginally or significantly less poor. That's a world I would much prefer. If I merely have to have a world that is just as illegitimate as the UN, where the West has just as much power, but when those Western countries, or China, exercise that power, poor countries get a boatload of money in compensation for it. That is the world that I want to live in. And I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that is the world that you want to live in. So before I go on to summarize the debate, I want to speak to the extension that came out of closing opposition, because I think that it was a little bit ridiculous in a few ways. The first, so the whole idea of short-term national interest versus long-term interests, okay? I think that countries have a very good way of determining this. So many countries will often take long-term bets on development strategies instead of paying for something today. And if they're an authoritarian regime that can't make that decision, or if they're just bad at making decisions, they won't make it anymore. What we're talking about is countries like my favorite, Togo, or Botswana, for instance, who do make long-term decisions in their best interest. But then she says it's a bad thing that countries would prioritize their own citizens, the people that live in their country now, i.e. the people that vote for them, over international law. We call that being a good government. We say that ultimately a government that makes more people in your country able to buy food today is the one that we should be supporting. Secondly, this idea that even if we wanted their cosmopolitanism, even if we wanted countries to be no longer operated on the self-interest of the people that live in that country, but of all the people very far away, we say, how do you move to this? Because if the WikiLeaks outing has shown us everything. It's that every country operates on a realpolitik, and that the countries that say they don't are lying. We said that ultimately countries that have operated under this realpolitik and have gotten a slice of the pie have been the ones that have been most successful, while it might have been the one, like for instance Colombia, who refused to support China on principal reasons, while other allies were getting boatloads of money from them, was not able to have that money that their allies had access to for 30 years until they recently changed this in an underground deal. We think that ultimately if they just had that money, it would have been a much better place, and the world wouldn't have been a significantly different place for it on the international stage. Finally, this idea that they're going to have to choose between short-term and long-term interests, we say that that's just a trade-off between self-interest. So for instance, countries that are currently voting against pollution regulations in the status quo because they're afraid of it hurting their country's bottom line economy. If another country, like let's say Denmark, who really cares about these things, was able to offer a boatload of money to offset the economic harm that would be done through pollution, we could ultimately have more policies going through, the kind of thing that they want to support. So, I'm going to believe this debate is a very simple one. It breaks down into two issues. The first is this better for the poor countries who would be able to sell them? And then secondly, what does this do to the legitimacy of the international organizations? And we believe we win on both counts. So the first question, is this better for the countries who would be selling their votes? We say that, first of all, in the status quo, it happens under the table and with sticks. There's something that has been uncontested. Now, what they contested is that countries that use sticks will continue to do so. I'm going to give you the reason why they won't in just a minute. Ma'am.
In Doha, the poor countries were able to outvote the rich countries despite a massive financial disadvantage. Under your model, doesn't it make it much harder for any kind of small poor country to refuse a financial offer from another country, even if it helps?
No, okay, wait, you can't have it both ways. Either it's a bad thing that the poor countries voted against pollution, or it's a good thing. If it's a good thing for those countries, they'll continue to do so. But if it was a bad thing, and if they could have had a win-win situation where they both get money and stop pollution, we think that would be the best scenario that happened on our side of the house. So, why countries that currently use sticks will prefer to use carrots if it's open and able to do so. This is the link that only my partner provided. The reasons why are that, one, because the barrier to payment has been lowered, so they're going to be more likely to use this payment system. Why would it be in their interest to use this payment system? One, because they don't have to sacrifice goodwill. I think Ukrainians hate it when Russia cuts off their oil in the winter. If Russia could instead give them loads of money, we think that not only would Russia gain their interest, but because Ukraine would like them better. We think Russia would prefer to use this method. Incidentally, Russia already takes an economic hit when they stop selling oil. So we think that ultimately any measure that a country does, it costs money to assassinate someone's president. We think that they'd just rather get that money in a lump sum instead of using that money to disadvantage the country. So we think that that is the reason why you'll see more countries benefiting being given carrots instead of sticks under our proposal. We also say that countries will get loads of money. This is something that has not been contested. And they just said that the the legitimacy of international organizations outweighs this. We say, crap. That is completely untrue. If you're an individual person living in any of these countries, what do you care about whaling regulations if you could instead get a whole lot of money to develop a nascent industry? We say that countries who are not doing this now are only ones that the status quo deters, i.e. countries on the up and up. Those countries should have access to this. We say that countries for whom, who would vote for an issue anyway can now get money. That would be great for them. We also say countries that have no interest in it can also get money. That would be great for them. This is the most important argument in the world because it is the only one that really affects people in a tangible way. We say that in the eyes of your people, right, if it's a bad idea for you to go through with this, we say there will be countries like Slovenia, for instance, who are patently incorruptible, who would never take a deal like this. We think that ultimately they're unlikely to do it. You can always say no if you don't want to participate in this vote for money scheme. But we say that ultimately, if you're able to build infrastructure in a way that you couldn't before, that is the benefit on the side of the House today. So what is the other question, the lesser question? What does this do to the legitimacy of international organizations? We say that realpolitik is already the norm. We say that people who know about the UN already know about all of the things that the first prop talked about how there is this, the leveraging of incredible debt to cripple countries. They already know that you're likely to throw on tariffs in order to bully countries around. Everybody knows that this is the way that it already works. And we say that ultimately what it does is make it more transparent. One, because we've already demonstrated that it's fairly hard to hide. But secondly, because if a country, the worst case scenario for a country would be to do it under the table and have it be exposed. We think that very few governments are likely to want to take that risk, especially in the world of new transparency that WikiLeaks and other things have brought about. So we think the best thing, the most likely thing they're going to do is just do it over the table to begin with. Especially because the opposition has argued both sides. They say that one, countries won't want to be seen doing this, but two, that'll be such a norm that it'll be totally okay to do this. We're likely to believe that it'll be totally okay to do this, and that countries will ultimately ultimately be able to have lots of money. We say that the legitimacy of the UN is only important in what the UN does. If the UN's purpose is to make the world better, and if our proposal makes the world better for the people living on the ground in these countries, we are very happy to propose. I'm going to propose this motion, and I believe you should too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. We go back to the opposition table, and I'd like to throw to Dirk to close the side of the House.
Ladies and gentlemen, in summing up this debate, I'm going to look at two main issues. Firstly, we're going to tell you exactly what the differences are between their proposal and the status quo, and why exactly it becomes worse if you pass this motion. Secondly, we're going to look at the decisions these organisations make, why exactly they're important, why people need to be involved, and secondly, how it changes the decision-making metric of the countries involved for the worse. Within that, I'm going to look at what second proposition brought in terms of why it's good for the citizens of deprived nations to be involved in this. Before I do that, I have 4 points of rebuttal. Firstly, Sam opened by saying that this is basically the world in which we live in which countries are already bribed to make choices that they otherwise wouldn't. We say they've never on the proposition given us a reason why we should feel that countries being bribed into making decisions that they otherwise wouldn't is in any way a good thing. I think that's maybe an important reason for them to give it. Moreover, we say that actually, under the status quo, we have a moral imperative for countries not to bribe other nations, because we think bribery is something that is wrong. We say that under their proposal, if it actually works properly, that this means that this happens all the time, or at least more than it currently does. No, thank you. Then Sam tried to accuse us, this is my second point in the book, by saying, no, we tried to have some inconsistency of saying either it happens always, or the good countries won't do it because they don't want to be seen to be bribed. We say, if good countries that, like Slovenia, don't want to be seen to be corrupt, but we say they still won't bribe, what that means is it gives excess power to the bad countries who will bribe, who can take out their wallets and get the most out from their policies, which is fact, considering they are bad countries, as we've outlined, are not good policies. No, thank you. They told us that the benefit their policy would bring would be transparency, that now we would know everybody was being bribed. We say everybody being bribed isn't good. We say this is the moment we can as first opposition showed you, we can show that people are being bribed, and that generally doesn't go so well. Finally, they said, well, wasn't it terrible that Colombia stood up to China and then didn't get any money, even though everybody else is getting money? We say maybe, potentially, Colombia benefited by standing up to China. Maybe there was something morally imperative for them to stand up to China, and we think it's much worse when they're forced to give up that stance because they have to exchange it for development of their peoples. No, thank you. So how exactly did their proposal change anything from the status quo? Well, we say, first off, all of the bad things they talked about, like Russia cutting off oil, like countries indebting other nations, still go on into the point of under their proposal. Because what happens is that you need an incentive to make them take your bribe. You need something to say that you will take ours. We say, part of our bribe is that we will now waive your debt. You therefore still have an incentive to indebt those countries. We say it's always cheaper for Russia to just cut off their oil rather than pay in that debt.
No.
Secondly, what it does is that it tacitly endorses that sort of behaviour because it says it's legitimate for you to influence other nations. No, thank you. They try to say that Russia does this at this moment because it's the only way they can have influence over other people's votes. You say, why do you think it's all right that they have influence over other people's votes? People should be allowed to make an independent decision over what happens. And even if that doesn't happen at the moment, we think that's something we should strive for it to happen, rather than just accept that it's all right. No, thank you. They said that now there's some sort of imperative for them to convince them to vote for that proposal. We say yes, the way they were convincing it is with a huge check, not by any way convincing them that their policy is something that will benefit them or benefit the globe. I'll take over.
Yeah, at the moment, a country considering the short-term effect on their civilians is most likely to choose to give in to China's demands as opposed to having debts called in. Under our model, China and the US don't have an incentive to build up that debt in the first place because they don't expect to need it and they want to avoid the bad rep they might get.
Okay, this is what we just told you. They still have the incentive to indebt that nation because they want something to push forward and say, part of our bribe is that we will waive your debt. That means that the country still has a short-term goal to give into that because they still know that debt could be called in, or they still know that their gas and oil could be cut off, or they still have something else that means that country has something over them that they can get it. We don't think that this changes it significantly. We say, they also told us that this means that countries can try and get some sort of change to the proposal. We say no, it doesn't. It means that they will abandon that small change for even more money. Moreover, we say that good policies, and this is what Derval told you in our extension, are fundamentally harmed. Because countries that would otherwise vote for them can now go up to the nations who are competing and say, whichever one of you gives me the most money is the one I will vote for, particularly when they don't have an immediate direct effect on them. We say what this means is firstly you allow those countries to extort money from people. approval. We think that that's harmful. But secondly, what we say in worst case scenario is that the negative one, if they don't want to vote for it, will offer them more money, or the country promoting the good policy will not want to give in to this bribery, and therefore will deny the payment, which means that small countries will vote against them, even though it's not in their interest or not something they ever would have done. No, thank you. Moreover, we say that blocs are harmed because now they have an immediate incentive. It creates a prisoner's dilemma that the first one to opt out and sell their vote is the most valuable. Secondly, the decisions that these organisations make and the effect on the nation statistics. We say that these are global organisations that we're talking about. Durban already discussed this, so that their decisions have global effects. Their decisions actually affect every nation. We say, even if you live in like Slovenia or Togo, you're still affected by the American-Iraq war. You still live in a less secure world. And we say that saying that you no longer have a vote in that is something harmful.
No.
We say that we think, particularly when it comes to things like environmental protection or protecting endangered species like in the whaling conventions, we say that you remove yourself from that discussion. You say it doesn't affect you. And we say that that's not what the UN is about. The UN is about people recognising that your decisions have global effects. We say, moreover, we expect nations to give particular consideration for something other than their own national selfish interests. Because this is what Durban told you, that we think that people should be considerate about what happens in the world when they make their decision, and they shouldn't be allowed to exclude them from it. No, thank you. We say, furthermore, as I've already told you, even if they do care, they're more likely to sell because they have to weigh up their short-term and long-term interests or their local and international issues. So if it's a decision between having an influx of cash so you pay for greater health care for your people, you'll always sell that for the consideration of Iraqi citizens dying in another nation. You no longer have to take responsibility for that decision, or you no longer have to think that that is something for you to take effect on. We say that you abandon your moral standing. They said, some countries can say no to bribes, like Slovenia will always say no to a bribe. But in the same breath, they told you that countries who would always vote for that can still get the money out of it, so will still accept the bribe. So we don't think that they can have it both ways within that. So how is it good for the citizens of the nation? They say, first off, all the harm for the status quo, as I already told you, still exists. They'll still bribe their diplomats, so they'll get less effect. Secondly, we say international involvement is integral to the idea of a sovereign nation. Your ability to engage with that is always important, and losing your independence, as we told you all along, is something harmful. Being a proxy for another nation is always harmful to your independent standing, and we don't want to do that. Finally, it harms your long-term choices. So if you're forced to give in to the Kyoto Protocol, even though it's not in your individual interest, as we see in a lot of developing nations, it means that you're harmed because you need that short-term influx, rather than recognising the long-term effects that it means that you actually get growth, that you can't any longer actually benefit. So even if it's in the West's interest that we have less environmental, or that we have greater environmental protections, that doesn't mean it's in those national interests, and we don't think we should be able to override them just because it suits us. Ladies and gentlemen, the status quo will still exist under their proposal. All we will have is something worse. That means that nobody ever can stand up or deny a bribe, so we beg to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thank you all very much for the debate. So we have one more round of applause for this debate. All right, we have to use this room to judge, so if the audience please be so kind to leave this room. No, you just announced it. So.